The king's gambit begins with e4, e5, f4. White offers a pawn to divert the black e-pawn. If black accepts the gambit, white has two main plans. The first is to play d4, and bishop takes f4, regaining the gambit pawn with central domination. The alternative plan is to play knight f3, and bishop c4, followed by castle. When the semi-open f-file created after a pawn push to g3 allows white to attack the weakest point in black's position, the pawn on f7. Theory has shown that, in order to maintain the gambit pawn, black may well be forced to weaken the king side with moves such as g5 or odd piece placement, for example knight f6 to knight h5. A downside to the king's gambit is that it weakens white's king's position, exposing it to the latent threat of queen h4 or bishop e7 to bishop h4. With a black pawn on f4, it is not usually viable for white to respond to the check with g3. But if the king moves, then it also loses the right to castle. The king's gambit is one of the oldest documented openings, appearing in one of the earliest chess books in 1497. However, today we know that black has several methods to gain equality. The king's gambit has been played by many of the strongest players in many of the greatest brilliancies, including the immortal game. Nevertheless, players have held widely divergent views about the opening. Bobby Fischer wrote a famous article, A Bust of the King's Gambit, in which he stated, "In my opinion the King's Gambit is busted. It loses by force," and offered his Fischer Defense. d6. David Branstein was the first grandmaster in decades to use the King's Gambit in serious play. He inspired Boris Spassky to play the King's Gambit and he beat many strong players with it. A handful of grandmasters have continued to use it, including Joseph Gallagher, Hikaru Nakamura, Bhaskara Iban, Nigel Short, and Alexei Fedorov. King's Gambit Accepted. E takes f4. Although black usually accepts the gambit pawn, two methods of declining the gambit, the classical defense, bishop c5, and the Falkbeer Countergambit, d5, are also popular. After e takes f4, the two main continuations for white are knight f3, the king's knight's gambit, and bishop c4, the bishop's gambit, king's knight's gambit, knight f3. This is the most popular move. It develops the knight and prevents queen h4. Black's two main approaches are to attempt to hold on to the pawn with g5, or to return the pawn in order to facilitate development. The classical variation arises after g5. Black defends the f4 pawn, and threatens to kick the f3 knight with g4, or else to consolidate with bishop g7 and h6. The main continuations traditionally have been h4 and bishop c4. More recently, knight c3. The Quaade Gambit, or Quaade attack, has been recommended by Scottish Grandmaster John Shaw as a less explored alternative to h4 and superior to bishop c4, h4, Kieseritzky Gambit, and Allgaier Gambit. With h4, white practically forces g4, thereby undermining any attempt by black to set up a stable pawn chain with h6 and bishop g7. The Kieseritzky Gambit, g4, knight e5, is considered by modern writers such as Shaw and Gallagher to be the main line. Boris Spassky used it to beat Bobby Fischer in a famous game at Mar del Plata in 1960. The main line of the Kieseritzky Gambit is considered to be knight f6, bishop c4, d5, e takes d5, bishop d6, d4. With an unclear position, the long whip variation, h5. That's dubious. White has bishop c4, rook h7, or knight h6, is considered old-fashioned and risky, as black loses a lot of time attempting to hold on to the pawn. Knight g5 is the Allgaier Gambit, intending h6. Knight takes f7. This knight sacrifice is considered unsound. Muzio Gambit and others. The extremely sharp Muzio Gambit arises after castle. G takes f3. Queen takes f3. Where white has sacrificed a knight but has 3 pieces bearing down on f7. Such wild play is rare in modern chess, but black must defend accurately. Perhaps the sharpest continuation is the double Muzio after Queen f6. e5. Queen takes e5. Bishop takes f7. Interesting, leaving white 2 pieces down in 8 moves, but with a position that some masters consider to be equal. In practice, white's play seems to be easier, especially when the opponent is surprised by such daring tactics. Similar lines are the Cunningham Gambit. Bishop c4. g4. d4. And the MacLeod Gambit. Bishop c4. g4. Knight c3. These are generally considered inferior to the Muzio, which has the advantage of reinforcing white's attack along the f-file. Also inferior is the Allgaier Gambit. Bishop takes f7. That's dubious. Which leaves white with insufficient compensation for the piece after. King takes f7. Knight e5. King e8. Queen takes g4. Knight f6. Queen takes f4. d6. The Schallopp Gambit. Bishop c4. g4. Knight e5. Queen h4. King f1. Is considered better for black due to the insecurity of white's king. Black may play safely with knight h6. Or counter-sacrifice with f3. Or knight c6. Bishop g7. Hanstein Gambit and Philidor Gambit. A safer alternative to g4 is bishop g7, which usually leads to the Hanstein Gambit after d4, d6, castle, h6, or the Philidor Gambit after h4, h6, d4, d6. Other move orders are possible in both cases. Knight c3. Quaade Gambit. The move has received renewed attention following its recommendation by John Shaw in his 2013 book on the King's Gambit. A well-known trap here is g4. Knight e5. Queen h4. g3. F takes g3. Queen takes g4. g2. Bad move. Here, after knight takes g4. d5. It's about equal. Now, after queen takes h4. g times h1. Promoting to a queen. White has queen h5. Yeah. Good move. And white is close to winning. Black's best defense is considered to be knight h6. d4. d6. Bishop takes h6. d takes e5. Queen takes e5. Bishop e6. Queen takes h8. Knight d7. Bishop takes f8. Castle queenside. And white will emerge a clear pawn ahead. Instead, bishop g7 has been recommended. d6 and h6. Transposed to Fischer's Defense and Becker's Defense, respectively. Also possible is knight c6. Recommended by Konstantin Sakhaev. After bishop g7. d4. g4. In his DVD and Chess.com video series, Simon Williams advocates bishop takes f4. G takes f3. White is down a knight, but has a strong attack. d4. Rosentreter Gambit. This is likely to lead to similar positions to the Quaade Gambit, however. g4. Knight e5. Queen h4. g3. F takes g3. With queen takes g4. The position is about equal. Here, black has g2. Interesting. It's now viable due to the threat against the pawn on e4. After, queen takes h4. G times h1. Promoting to a queen. Sure recommends for white. Knight c3. With a complicated position. Becker Defense. h6. The Becker Defense has the idea of creating a pawn chain on h6. g5. f4. To defend the f4 pawn, while avoiding the Kieseritzky Gambit, so black will not be forced to play g4. When white plays to undermine the chain with h4, white has the option of b3. Although the main line continues with d4, g5, and usually transposes to lines of the classical variation after bishop c4, bishop g7, castle. Bonch-Osmolovsky Defense. Knight e7. The rarely seen Bonch-Osmolovsky Defense aims to defend the f4 pawn with knight g6. A relatively safe square for the knight compared to the Schallopp Defense. It was played by Mark Blufstein to defeat former world title finalist Nigel Short at Montreal 2007, even though it has never been highly regarded by theory. Cunningham Defense. Bishop e7. The Cunningham Defense threatens a check on h4 that can permanently prevent white from castling. Furthermore, if white does not immediately develop the king's bishop, king e2 would be forced, which hems the bishop in. A sample line is knight c3, bishop h4, king e2, d5, knight takes d5, knight f6, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, d4, bishop g4, queen d2. White has strong central control with pawns on d4 and e4, while black is relying on the white king's discomfort to compensate. To avoid having to play king e2, bishop c4 is white's most popular response. Anyway, black can play bishop h4, forcing king f1, or else the wild burden gambit, or three pawns gambit, as played in the 19th century. g3. F takes g3. Castle. G takes h2. King h1. In modern practice, it is more common for black to simply develop instead with knight f6, e5, knight g4, known as the modern Cunningham. An underexplored but seemingly playable line here is knight e4. Interesting, the Urview variation, which has a number of trappy ideas. Schallopp Defense. Knight f6. The Schallopp Defense is usually played with the intention of holding on to the pawn after e5, knight h5. While it is not black's most popular option, it attracted some attention in 2020 when Din Liren used it to beat Magnus Carlsen. The undefended knight on h5 means black must be careful, for example, d4, d6, queen e2. And here, black has d5. Yeah. Good move. The position is about equal. After, bishop e7. Bad move. Because white has. He takes d6. Queen takes d6. Queen b5. Winning the h5 knight. Modern defense. d5. The modern defense, or Allgaier defense, has much the same idea as the Falkbeer Countergambit, and can in fact be reached by transposition. For example, e takes d5. E takes f4. Black concentrates on gaining piece play and fighting for the initiative rather than keeping the extra pawn. It has been recommended by several publications as an easy way to equalize, although white's extra central pawn and piece activity gives white a slight advantage. If white captures e takes d5, then black may play knight f6, or recapture with queen takes d5, at which point it becomes the Scandinavian variation of King's Gambit Accepted. This variation was considered most critical in the past, but recent trends seem to indicate a slight advantage for white. Fischer Defense d6. Fischer wrote, "The refutation of any gambit begins with accepting it. In my opinion, the King's Gambit is busted. It loses by force." The Fischer Defense, although previously known, was advocated by Bobby Fischer after he was defeated by Boris Spassky in a Kieseritzky Gambit, and the next year the American Chess Quarterly published Fischer's analysis of the move d6, which he called a high-class waiting move. Fischer Defense after knight g1. The point is that after d4, g5, h4, g4, white cannot continue with knight e5. As in the Kieseritzky Gambit, knight g5 is unsound because black has f6. Yeah. Good move. Trapping the knight, and knight f to d2 blocks the bishop on c1. This leaves the move knight g1 as the only option, when after 6 moves neither side has developed a piece. The resulting slightly odd position offers white good attacking chances. A typical continuation is bishop h6, knight e2, queen f6, knight bc3, c6, g3, f3, knight f4, queen e7. With an unclear position, the main alternative to d4 is bishop c4. Play usually continues h6, d4, g5, castle, bishop g7, transposing into the Hanstein Gambit. MacLeod Defense, knight c6. Joe Gallagher writes that knight c6 has never really caught on, probably because it does nothing to address black's immediate problems. Like Fischer's Defense, it is a waiting move. An obvious drawback is that the knight c6 may prove a target for the d-pawn later in the opening. Wagenbach Defense h5. An invention of the Hungarian-English player János Wagenbach. John Shaw writes, if given the time, black intends to seal up the king side with h4, followed by g5, securing the extra pawn on f4, without allowing the undermining h4. The drawback is of course the amount of time required. Bishop's Gambit, bishop c4. Of the alternatives to knight f3, white allows queen h4, king f1, losing the right to castle, but this loses time for black after the inevitable knight f3. And white will develop rapidly. White also has the option of delaying knight f3, and can instead play g3. Interesting, after which the game becomes quite sharp, with white having the option of queen f3, with an attack on f7, or king g2, threatening h takes g3. This idea is advocated, among others, by Grandmaster Simon Williams. Kortnoy and Zach recommend as best for black knight f6, knight c3, c6, or the alternative move order c6, knight c3, knight f6. After bishop b3, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, d4, bishop d6, knight ge2, castle, castle, g5, knight takes d5, knight c6. Black was somewhat better in the game Spielman vs Bogolyubo, Marichestra 1923. Black's other main option is d5. Returning the pawn immediately. Play might continue. Bishop takes d5. Knight f6. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Knight f3. Bishop takes c3. D takes c3. c6. Bishop c4. Queen takes d1. King takes d1. Castle. Bishop takes f4. Knight takes e4. With an equal position. Knight c6. Interesting. The Muzio defense is relatively untested, but if white plays knight f3, black can transpose into the Hanstein Gambit after g5. d4. Bishop g7. c3. d6. Castle. h6. Steinitz, knight e7. And the counter gambit, f5, are generally considered inferior because white has queen e2. Yeah. Good move. Other third moves for white. Other third moves for white are rarely played. Some of these are knight c3. The Mason Gambit, or Karras Gambit. d4. The Wilhelmsen Gambit, or Steinitz Gambit. Bishop e2. The Lesser Bishop's Gambit, or Tartakower Gambit. Queen f3. The Breyer Gambit, or Hungarian Gambit. g3. The Gamma Gambit. h4. The Stumme Gambit. Knight h3. The Eisenberg Gambit. King f2. That's dubious. The tumbleweed. King's Gambit declined. Black can decline the offered pawn, or offer a counter gambit. Falkbeer Countergambit. d5. The Falkbeer Countergambit is named after the 19th century Austrian master, Ernst Falkbeer. It runs e takes d5. e4. In which black sacrifices a pawn in return for quick and easy development. It was once considered good for black and scored well, however, white obtains some advantage with the move. d3. Yeah. Good move. A more modern interpretation of the Falkbeer follows. E takes d5. c6. Interesting, as advocated by Aaron Nimzowitsch. Black is not concerned about pawns and aims for early piece activity. White has a better pawn structure and prospects of a better endgame. The main line continues. Knight c3. E takes f4. Knight f3. Bishop d6. d4. Knight e7. D takes c6. Knight c6. Giving positions analogous to the modern variation of the Gambit Accepted. Classical defense. Bishop c5. A common way to decline the gambit is with Bishop c5. The classical King's Gambit declined. The bishop prevents white from castling and is such a nuisance that white often expends 2 tempi to eliminate it, by means of knight a4. To exchange on c5. Or b6. After which white may castle without worry. It also contains an opening trap for novices, if white continues with f takes e5. Whoa, that's a blunder. Because black has queen h4. In which either the rook is lost. g3. Queen takes e4. Forking the rook and king, or white is checkmated. King e2. Queen takes e4. Checkmate. This line often comes about by transposition from lines of the Vienna game, or bishop's opening, when white plays f4. Before knight f3. One rarely seen line is the Rodolphe counter gambit. Knight f3. d6. b4. Interesting. The idea of the gambit is similar to that seen in the Evans Gambit of the Italian game. White sacrifices a pawn to try and build a strong center with bishop takes b4. c3. Bishop c5. Or bishop a5. f takes e5. d takes e5. d4. However, this line is considered slightly dubious. Other second moves for black. Other options in the King's Gambit declined are possible, though unusual, such as the Adelaide counter gambit. Knight c6. Knight f3. f5. Advocated by Tony Miles. d6. When, after knight f3. Best is e takes f4. Transposing to the Fischer defense, though. d6 invites white to play d4. And knight f6. F takes e5. Knight takes e4. After knight f3. Black has knight g5. Yeah. Good move. The line continues. d4. Knight takes f3. Queen takes f3. Queen h4. Queen f2. Queen takes f2. King takes f2. With a small endgame advantage, as played in the 1968 game between Bobby Fischer and Bob Wade, in Winkelchi. The greedy Queen f6, known as the Nordwald variation, intending Queen takes f4, is considered dubious. Also dubious are the King defense, Queen h4, g3, Queen e7, and the Mafia defense, c5, f5. That's dubious. Is among the oldest counter-gambits in King's Gambit declined, known from a game published in 1625 by Gioacchino Greco. Vincenzo Rubi also played it against Mikhail Chigorin in 1882. It is nonetheless considered dubious because e takes f5, with the threat of queen h5, gives white a good game. Related lines. In several lines of the Vienna game, white offers a sort of delayed King's Gambit. In the Vienna Gambit, e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4. Black should respond with d5, since e takes f4. That's dubious, because white has e5, forcing the knight to retreat. Knight c6, f4. E takes f4. May lead to the Hamp, Muzio Gambit after knight f3. g5. Bishop c4. g4. Castle. G takes f3. Queen takes f3. Or to the Steinitz Gambit after d4. Queen h4. King e2. Both of these lines may be reached via the King's Gambit proper, but the Vienna move order is more common. White may also offer the gambit in the bishop's opening, for example, e4, e5, bishop c4, knight c6, f4. Though this is uncommon. Encyclopedia of Chess Openings. The Encyclopedia of Chess Openings has 10 codes for the King's Gambit, c30 through c39, as follows. c30, e4, e5, f4. The King's Gambit. c31, d5. The Falkbeer Countergambit. c32, e takes d5, e4, d3. Knight f6. The Morphy, Karusek, etc. c33, e takes f4. The King's Gambit Accepted. c34. Knight f3. The King's Knight's Gambit. c35. Bishop e7. The Cunningham Defense. c36. d5. The Allgaier Defense. c37. g5. Knight c3. Or, Bishop c4. g4. Castle. The Muzio Gambit. c38. Bishop c4. Bishop g7. The Philidor, Hanstein, etc. c39. h4. The Allgaier, Kieseritzky, etc.